Okay, welcome to Unit 5, the command line interface tool. We're going to do this unit as a workshop, and as a result it will probably take longer than most of the other screencasts we've done. And you'll no doubt notice me making a few more typos and otherwise a few more errors than might otherwise occur. So I apologize for that up front. The other important thing about this particular workshop is that there is a server group created as part of the workshop that you'll need for future labs in future modules. So it would be a good idea to perform this workshop yourself post watching the video. Or at least the section that creates the server group, the new server group. Okay, so let's get on. The mechanism for starting the command line interface is to run the JBoss CLI script, which is in the JBoss bin directory. So you can see that here. We can launch this script by itself, in which case it'll start disconnected. We can connect with the connect command, and you now see that we are connected live. Alternatively, you can launch the JBoss command line script with the relevant entries, such as this, and it will connect directly into an active session against the server. If you're connecting to a domain controller that is remote, i.e. not on the same machine, you'll almost certainly be asked for a username and password of the admin account. Okay, so let's start off by talking about reading a resource. The structure of the actually what we'll do is we'll start off by covering help. Help gives you a clue as to how to use the tool. The general hierarchy of the objects within the management interface is very roughly analogous to a file system. So you can issue commands like cd and ls and pwd much the same as you can in a Linux environment. If you're not familiar with Linux, then ignore what I just said. But strictly speaking, we refer to these things as nodes. Probably the key difference is that a node has a name, and so when referencing a node we tend to specify node type and node name. And much the same as the file system, we use the / as a path delimiter between nodes. We can optionally append, and in some cases must append, an operation to our command. An operation is separated from the node path by a colon, and the operation itself may take in parameters, at the very least probably a name equals value pair, which are normally enclosed in brackets. Some operations don't require a name equals value pair, and some operations may even require additional attributes. If the operation doesn't require any additional attributes to be passed in, then you don't need the brackets at all. So here, for instance, is an example of the subsystem, the web subsystem, the connector, the HTTP connector, and doing a read of an attribute associated with this connector, the attribute being the protocol attribute, Being the HTTP connector, you would probably expect that to be the HTTP protocol. Generally speaking, white spaces are not particularly significant, so you don't have to be too concerned about them. And the other nice thing is that the hierarchy can be a little confusing, but is relatively easy to navigate, because in a lot of places you'll find tab completion is supported. Perhaps the other useful thing to mention is that the command line inside the interactive shell here does support a lot of the same shortcuts that Bash shell environments support. So for instance, the up arrow, the down arrow, the control left, control right, control A for beginning of line, control E for the end of line, control U to clear to the beginning of the line, control K to clear to the end of the line. So there's a number of shortcuts there that you can leverage. The other thing is also the interface keeps a history, which allows you to reuse previous commands fairly easily. And as you can see from the list of commands, you can do things like deploy and undeploy as well. We'll take a look at a number of these things in more detail. This is only a introduction, so we're not going to be delving into everything in detail, and in fact we're going to be only lightly touching on the majority of what you can do with the command line interface. So back to my reading of a resource. Generally speaking, you can issue read resource, and there's tab completion occurring. Actually, read resource with tab completion, you can see it's prompting and saying that there are two matches, read resource and read resource description. Read resource is fairly commonly used. Unfortunately, because of the fact that there's also a dash description, you also are always prompted for whether you want to stop or add the description component. We just want to do a read resource. The output of this is in a format that's known as DMR, and this format is roughly synonymous with JSON, if you're familiar with that as a protocol for sending data between clients and servers, usually. Often implemented in things like web services and RESTful web services and JavaScript style communications, and generally it boils down to an array of key value pairs being passed around. The machine is able to interpret the text because of the context. This is also in a format that's known as typeless. Java is a strongly typed language, and DMR is type free, which largely means most of the values are simple data types, strings and numbers generally. If none of that means anything to you, that's fine. You don't, strictly speaking, need to know most of that information. So here we see some general output. We see that there's an application deployed. We see the extensions that are registered. We see the hosts that are registered, the interfaces, the profiles, server groups, socket binding groups, system properties, etc. So you might recognize those if I do another variation of that, where I begin typing in the path and press tab to provide autocomplete for me. If you look at these values here, you might recognize most of these values as being essentially the root of the root tags of the config files. In this case, the domain config file, because I'm working against a domain controller here. So excuse me, the extension, host, socket binding group, server group, profile, etc. These are all primary level tags within the domain config file, and you would have a similar sort of output if you were working against the standalone server instance. And of course, with the DMR output here, we actually see a level down from just these tags. Let's continue our push with auto tab complete and look at host. And at this point in time, I'm largely following the workshop. So host, and here we see that there are two of them, host 2 and host 3. So if I choose host 2, at this point I might choose to do a read resource, and from here I see things like system properties that are defined, core services, interfaces, JVM and server configs. Of course, if I use the up arrow key and remove the read resource, I can drill down even further to say perhaps server equal to try production server A, which is one of the registered servers on the in the configuration, and we can do a read resource. We can see the various settings as they pertain to the production server A instance. So again, lots of useful information in there, and you might recognize again a lot of these largely align with the sections within the various config files. So there's a very strong correlation in the hierarchy to the configuration files. If anything, the DMR hierarchy is probably slightly flatter than the XML hierarchy, but they certainly align. Okay, we've largely touched on tab completion, and you've seen it already. You can use tab completion for paths, which we've seen. You can also see tab completion for operations. So this is the list of available operations. You can, generally speaking, what I would suggest you do with tab completion is try it. Try it wherever you want to have the system try and complete the next part of the command line for you, whatever that next part may be. That could be a node name, a node value, a operation name, and operation values even in some cases. So just try it as you're using the command line. You'll find you very quickly adapt to the available autocomplete options that it gives you. Okay, so let's move on to instead the reading a resource recursively. One of the options that can be helpful if you're not entirely sure what the structure of the underlying resource is the option to use recursive as a parameter to read resource. As an aside, using recursive at the top level here in a domain may not necessarily be the best thing to do. It'll return often several hundred, certainly possibly even several thousand lines, depending on the size of your domain and how many various subtrees and attributes there are within those subtrees. So it basically walks the entire tree underneath the root level that you call the read resource recursive command on. So because I'm at the root of the hierarchy here, it's output the entire tree structure, including every attribute that's in there. And that's a big file. If you start from a much lower level in the hierarchy of the tree, then you're going to get a much smaller output. And one of the things you can do is redirect to a file or something like that, where you can at some later stage parse that or read it or review it at a point in time that's convenient to yourself. I mentioned that the hierarchy was it's Control U in operation. I mentioned earlier that the hierarchy is similar in nature to a file system. So one of the things you can do in a file system is change directories, and you can, for all intents and purposes, here as well. So we were in the host entry before, and when you change, you see that also much the same as a bash prompt, it updates the host details, or it actually updates the path details to the most current path, so that you've got some idea of where you are. And you can do an ls command, which is roughly synonymous to a read resource at the same level. The primary difference between them is read resource is always going to return a DMR style output, whereas ls is going to give you much more of a file system style output, something that's possibly a little easier to read, but maybe not quite so informational. There's a certain amount of derived information by looking at the DMR output, such as hierarchies and so forth. So depending on your preference and your use case, you can use either or. Let's next take a look at changing a resource attribute. In this case, what we're going to do is, and you can jump quickly back to the root, so there's cd root. Let's navigate to profile, default profile, subsystem, and we're going to have a look at the data sources. And the data source that is example ds. Now here's an example where the node name was populated automatically because there was only one data source. If there had been multiple data sources, then of course we would potentially have had to choose or at least begin typing a number of letters to pick a particular data source. So we're now in this level, and I can do an ls. From here I can see minimum pool size set to 0. Of course I could have done the same thing with something like a read attribute. The potential downside of read attribute is that you generally need to know or have some idea of the attributes that you're looking for, and you've got to pass in an attribute name like that, and there you can see essentially the same information in a different format being returned. Now if I wanted to update that, you might guess of course that the equivalent command, or the command for updating, is write. And as you might guess, it largely follows the same format, except that if I'm going to write something in there, I need to pass in what it is that I want to write as a value. So in this case we'll set the minimum pool to 5. We can see that that succeeded, and I could do an ls for instance and see that that succeeded. perhaps another way of viewing that would also be to have a look in the domain configuration file and see also that the value has been populated in there. You notice that gedit was telling me the file had changed because it had changed from when I last looked at it by the fact that this value had been updated. So this is the XML configuration file, obviously, domain.xml, and is in fact the file that we're working against at this point in time. So that's how you would update an attribute. You can also do things like add data or add parts, add information to the config file. So what we'll do is take a look at next an add operation. Again, we'll jump to our root here. An add operation allows you to add resources essentially to the configuration file, and this is potentially useful when, for instance, you start with perhaps say a relatively bare configuration file and you want to build out the configuration dynamically. There's certain circumstances when that could be useful to you. Another very powerful use case for this would be dynamically adding a server instance to a cluster, as an example. But let's look at adding a excuse me, a simple resource, a system property, remembering that a system property is something that can be looked up by applications running on your server. It's a little bit like a environment variable in a bash shell. It's an environment variable for the system. So it has a name and it has a value, and it can be looked up by an application. You can use system properties using the $curly brace mechanism in your configuration files, so you can reuse the value in your system property. And you can typically set the value of the system property with -d command line attributes when you're starting your server instance. So system properties can be quite useful. In this case, if we do tab, you'll see that there's two currently set up in there. Let's add another one, my.prop, and to do that we're going to need to use the add command, and we're going to need to give it a value. System properties are just key value pairs. The key in this case, my.prop, and the value equal to hello. No, actually let's make it a number, 65, whatever. Okay, if we do autocomplete here, you can see my prop, and if we specify my prop with read resource, you'll see that that property has in fact been set in there. And again, if I flicked back over to, I won't bother, but if I flick back over to the configuration file and went down to the system properties section, we should see that that property is now part of the configuration file. The next thing that we're going to add is in fact the add operation that you'll need to perform for your future exercises. So this is the server group. So you would do server group, you would nominate the relevant name, in this case QA group, and as part of setting up a server group, we need to do so by specifying add. And if you press tab at this point in time, you'll see the potential values that you can add or associate with the sub-elements or the sub-properties that you can associate with QA group. Primarily the ones that we're particularly interested in nominating, because you can't really create a group without them, are profile and generally socket binding group. Other attributes might be useful, but at the very least you typically want to set those. So profile, for instance, we want full HA. Is it full HA or HA full? I better have a look at our notes for this one. Yes, no, it is full HA. And socket, our socket binding group, and again that's going to be full HA sockets. So that adds at a minimum the two key attributes of a server group that all server groups pretty much need. And so as a result, now if I do server group, we should see that QA group is there, and of course if I do QA group read resource, we should see that it has the full HA profile associated with it, and of course the full HA sockets as the socket binding set. So you can see that it's very easy to dynamically build up your configuration as part of working with your command line interface. Of course, you could batch a number of these operations into a batch file and run them as a shell script. If you're struggling to construct the appropriate commands and populate the various values without having to take guesses and so forth, then you might want to investigate the GUI aspect of the command line interface tool. The command line interface tool does have a GUI, even though it's a command line interface, and that's accessed by passing -- GUI into the JBoss CLI script. I would encourage you to have a bit of a play with that at the end of this video as well. You'll find that as you create or play with your commands, it builds up a view of that you can copy and paste into, say, a script, so that you can try stuff out and build a script at the same time if you need to. Alright, that in fact pretty much covers everything I wanted to touch on within the context of this workshop. I once again apologize for any mistakes and coughs and so forth that I may have made while presenting this. It's a longer than normal screencast. So good luck with your attempt at doing the workshop yourself, and of course the following lab exercise.